So, now that my converter box has arrived, I've started to make up the RGB cables for my consoles. Now, most of them use a proprietary connector, so I'm either going to have to custom make pins to insert into the composite cables that I have, or add some RGB plugs to the backs of the consoles, which I'd probably prefer not to do. Anyway, so the next plug that I'm going to make is the Mega Drive 2. I've made Master System 1 and I've made Saturn. The Saturn was probably the hardest. It used a 10-pin mini DIN socket. The pins are so close together, it was ridiculous. The next one's pretty close actually. It's a 9-pin mini DIN plug. And I've got a little trick that I use, and that's what I'm going to show here today. So this is the plug here. Very close together pins. Back comes off. This breaks up into two halves. One of them gets thrown on the floor by me. There we go. And this, I guess, splits in half to get pins out. Yep, looks like that's how you're supposed to do it. So I'll just stretch that out just a little tiny bit and got the pins out. Like I said, there's a little trick that I do to get connectivity between these tiny little pins and the fat cable that I use. This is way too thick to solder each and every one of those, mainly because of the 3 mini coax cables inside there. So what I do is get a few lengths of this stuff, which is just the wire that you would pull out of a network cable. I just cut a length of that, not too much, just enough to get it outside of here, and then I solder the ends of those little wires onto the ends of these slightly fatter wires, and then when it's all together, cover the bunch of coloured wires with a bit of shrink wrap tubing. It doesn't really look like a store-bought cable, but it does the job, and considering that, you know, the RGB cables can be quite pricey, especially for good quality ones, I think that I'm prepared to have a bit of a lumpy bit of the cable than pay all that money for a bought one. So let's begin. What I usually do first is attach the SCART plug to the end of the VGA cable. There's the shell, put the plug in there, flip it over, and then this screws on. Once that's doubled over, that screws on there, holds the lot together. This is the metal shield that goes around the pins. Start off with the pins like that. And the first step is obviously to tin them so that we can solder to them easier later on. And so forth. The SCART plug comes in at an angle like that, so what I have to do, let's put the cable in and then cut each of these to length. So the first one is blue, and then green, and then red. Cut to length, strip them, and solder them down, and then worry about the little ones because they're a lot easier to deal with. Alright. Stripped the ends of the mini coax wires, and I'm going to solder them on. The wires are joined on there, and they've been put in at an angle so that once the cable's installed, It'll all go together nicely. Finally, we pop the completed product into the shell, fold it over, screw this up, and that pushes those teeth into the cable and locks it into place. The first step that I take is to tin these little lugs. Use a bit of solder and my disgusting old soldering iron. Actually, it's quite a good old soldering iron, but I haven't cleaned it for a while. Now there's a bit of solder on each of those pins. So I just separated out the strands so that we have individual pieces of wire. I'm going to strip the ends of them, tin them, and then attach one wire to each of these pins here. Just attach the wires like so. Now this cable is going to be for the Mega Drive. I've soldered the little lead wires into the end of the plug that will ultimately go into the Mega Drive. But there's this little sleeve that goes over it, and once that's on, this is actually too fat to go into the Mega Drive's plug, so I'm going to cut this down so that it only comes up to about there. So there's still something to grip to hold onto, but this will still fit. And so the plug now looks like that. We'll put some heat shrink tubing around that so that you won't hopefully see too much of it, but there will be a little prototype board off the back to hold the resistors and capacitor that the Mega Drive RGB cable needs. So the little prototype board is going to have one 75 ohm resistor for each channel, RGB, and one capacitor for each channel. These are needed because the RGB pins on the connector at the back of the console come straight out of the video processing chip, so you need to drop them down. Here's the components mounted on a little piece of Veriboard there. That'll go into a little black box that'll sit in line with the cable once it's assembled. I had problems with those two plastic shell halves coming apart, so put cable ties around it, and I've attached it to the circuit board. I've joined the red, green, blue channels to the piece of prototype board. Now I just have to join up the rest of the wires and maybe slip some heat shrink tubing over there just to tidy it up a bit. And there's what it looks like. We'll put a little black box or something around this bit so it doesn't look quite so terrible, but it's the finished product.